Before I introduce our speakers for the evening, I'll tell you a little bit about the Pedal Centre, just in case you're not familiar. So the Pedal Centre was set up over 3 years ago. It's the Centre for Research on Play in Education, Development and Learning. And it was started with a generous founding donation from the Lego Foundation. And we have 3 main aims. The first one is conducting world-class research on the topic of play. The second is building capacity in the field of play research. So we're very interested in developing people's understanding of research and skilling up people's research capacity to work in this area. And finally, we're also interested in engaging with stakeholders to influence policy and practice. And we hope that that's a two-way street, so that the stakeholder engagement will inform the research that we do, and the research that we do can then feed back into best practice for policy and practice. We have 3 main strands of research. So play in early life, that's led by our centre director, Professor Paul Ramchandani, who's sitting at the back there. The second strand is led by me, Jenny Gibson, social play, social lives, and that focuses on the social and emotional benefits of play. And finally, Dr. Sarah Baker has a research theme called Stepping Stones in Science, and she investigates science in the early years curriculum and how play can inform early science learning. I thought I'd take this opportunity to just say a little bit more about my own research strand that's leading the session today. So within the Pedal Centre, most of my research focuses on children's social development, and we've run 2 main studies to date. One is the hopscotch study, where we're looking at children's behaviour at school playtime and how changes to the environment might afford differences in social interactions and the kinds of benefits that children might get, the enjoyment that they might get from playtimes. And we developed a new method of understanding that behaviour by attaching GPS trackers to them, so that we could see exactly where they were moving and how they interacted in time and space. The second study is the children's relationships with peers through play study, and that's a study that's followed a group of children from reception year through that transition into year 1 and into year 2, and has asked questions about the relationship of play behaviour and children's pretend play capacities to develop their social skills and friendship skills and their abilities to take advantage of the learning opportunities on offer as they move through school. So that's a very quick overview of the research agenda in social play, social lives. When we had a chance to put on a public engagement event, I was very excited because it meant I could invite all my favourite speakers and get people that I was really interested to hear from. And I hope you'll agree that we've got a great lineup for this evening. Just to say a little bit about the format, we've asked each speaker to speak for 10 minutes. So they'll come up to the lectern in turn and then sit down again afterwards. And then at the end, all the speakers will come to the front and we'll have a panel discussion. So be thinking about some good questions to ask the speakers, but save them up right until we've heard from all 4 of them. I'll introduce the speakers now all together so that I don't have to keep getting up and back down again. So first up, we've got Nicola Butler. Nicola is the chair of Play England, and she's also the director of Hackney Play Association, and she's done lots for the advocacy of children's play in the UK. Next up, we've got Stephen Mitchell, or Mitch as he prefers to be called. He's the chair of Parkour UK, so we'll be really interested to hear your perspective on risk-taking in that particular context. Next up, we've got Kathryn Lester, who is an academic and an expert in children's anxiety, and she's going to explore some of the hypothesized links between self-regulation and emotional management and play. And finally, we've got Tim Gill, who's billed as an independent thinker. Tim is a consultant on children's play and is widely known in the play sector and beyond into the policy world. So it'll be really interesting to get his perspective on what the implications for the research and the messages from practice are on the wider scale of our society and beyond. So I think that's enough from me. I'll hand over to Nicola. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Jenny, and thank you for the Pedal Centre for inviting me tonight, and it's good to be here. As Jenny said, my day job is I work for an organisation called Hackney Play Association, and we manage 3 adventure playgrounds in Hackney, in East London, and so I kind of see my perspective as very much coming from the point of view as a practitioner. I'm not an academic by any stretch of the imagination, but my day job is to manage risk in play, and it's something that I think about really every day when I'm at work. Before we come to me, though, and how I manage risk, I want you to take a moment to have a think about your attitude to risk. So can I ask you to have a little chat with the person sitting next to you, just for a minute, and think about the question, do you feel that you are a risk taker? Are you the kind of person who would like to do a parachute jump, or maybe you'd like to try parkour, or maybe you're a more cautious person? Have a little talk to your neighbour and see what you think. Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt because you're clearly having a good time, but I've only got 10 minutes, so can I ask you to come back now? And can I ask any risk takers in the audience? Anybody who would define themselves as a risk taker? Okay, would any of the risk takers be prepared to tell me why? Why? What do you get out of it? Okay, Mitch. Okay, so let's have someone else. One of the risk takers. Why do you do it? I'm baffled. It's thrilling. Yeah, yeah. Any other reasons? Push yourself. Yeah, yeah. And these are some of the classic reasons people come up with for why they take risks. Also, huge sense of achievement. I often see working with children when they accomplish something for the first time and they push themselves to achieve something that they haven't thought maybe that they were able to do, that they get a huge sense of achievement out of that. I was a bit naughty at the beginning, and I talked very much about physical risk and parachute jumps and going to Alton Towers, but there are lots of different types of risk that we are all risk takers. We all cross roads, we all leave the house in the morning, and there are all kinds of risks that we take. We take on mortgages, we tell somebody that we love them for the first time. There are all sorts of emotional risks as well as physical risks that we all take. So my day job is working with adventure playgrounds, so that is considered by some to be quite risky. There are certain features of adventure playgrounds that do pose a certain level of risk. The most easily identifiable one is that in adventure playgrounds we usually use self-built structures which we have built ourselves, and we're actually exempt from play equipment industry standards, so we have to take responsibility for making sure that those structures are good enough for children to use. Other things that happen in adventure playgrounds, we allow children to use tools under supervision. So children get involved in building dens, and we also do a lot of activities like whittling. So children can use a knife, for instance, to make a gift for their parent or something like that. Third aspect that is quite risky in adventure playgrounds, we use what we call loose parts for play. So these could be any kind of movable object that children can manipulate and use as they choose in play. Adventure playgrounds, typically we quite often have a fire. That's considered quite risky. We use water, that's slippy and wet. And most adventure playgrounds will allow some degree of rough and tumble play as well. But I think maybe above all, an adventure playground is usually a very fast-changing environment, so we are dependent on our staff to take good judgments about how they manage risk and when and how they intervene. And this is a constant discussion that we're having with staff. You know, when is it appropriate to intervene? When do we stop something? When do we allow it to continue? And how do we do that and why? We also work in Hackney on street play, and the biggest risk in street play is traffic. There is another risk that is obviously concerning to a lot of residents. A lot of residents will say about street play, well, that's great, but I'm concerned that the children will damage my car when they're playing. And to which I respond, well, I'm concerned that your car will damage the children when they're playing. But it just shows you kind of where the balance lies when we're talking about risk in play. I also do some work in schools, and I think the biggest challenge in schools, I think, is the culture in school around the rules and children's behaviour. I'm going to be a little bit controversial, and I'd say that I think gender is a problem, particularly in schools. I'm the parent of a boy, and it is noticeable to me that my son was at a nursery full of women staff. He was at a primary school full of women staff. And when I go into schools as a trainer, I typically, every school I've worked with has had a male janitor, site manager, male sports coaches, female lunchtime staff, and predominantly female teaching staff at primary school. And I think this is actually quite a challenge for how we manage play in schools. 10 years ago, with risk in play, we were moving towards a position where we had to minimise risk at all cost, and there was a big drive on health and safety, and we have to keep children safe at all times. What was game-changing in our industry is the guidance that Tim was one of the authors of, Managing Risk in Play Provision, and this is the guidance that we use really every day in managing play. And how this guidance was different was, for the first time it said, rather than just reducing risks, we have to weigh up and balance the risks with what the benefits are. So fundamental to our approach is that we carry out a risk-benefit assessment of the play structures that we work with, and that we train our staff to make dynamic decisions about how they manage risk. So training is key for us. Leadership is also key. We're never going to get anywhere in the school if the head teacher is not on site, so leadership has got to be a big part of that. Just very quick highlights of the kind of things we look at in training. Obviously, we're looking at identifying risks, but we also try to identify the benefits. And often when I'm training, people go, well, it's fun, it's exhilarating, but that's not a good enough reason. You know, surely the children have got to be learning something. Fun is a good enough reason. Exhilaration is a good enough reason. What we also come up against a lot is sort of speculation. Oh, but this could happen and that could happen. They could break their leg. They could fall over and bang their head and die. They could drown in a puddle. You know, they could. And so it's really critical that, as well as looking at this likely severity of an accident or injury, that we look at the likelihood, because, you know, when I go into training, I often use the example of skipping, and people will say, oh, but, you know, the child could strangle themselves with the rope, or they could be hit in the eye or the face with the skipping rope handle. But actually, how likely is that? Really not very. So on balance, we have to weigh up the fun that's involved with the risks, and by that I mean the real risks. Risk of serious harm, not risk of a bruise, risk of a raised. Not even risk of a broken leg, risk serious harm, which is permanent injury or death. Lots things to say. We are at the stage where we've had a number of accidents, both at the adventure playground, also in street play, and also in schools. And fundamental to our approach is we have been prepared to contest accident claims for minor accidents very hard indeed, and to date we've won all of them. I'm happy to say we've never had a serious accident, but I know even from the minor accidents and injuries that it can have a massive emotional effect on the staff responsible and the staff who are there on the day. So one of the key things I think is to look after the professionals who are involved in this field and who are trying to enable children to have more exciting, risky play. We've got a movie on our website, and so sometime after this event you want to go and have a look, and you can see some of these mildly more risky activities which are nothing like as risky as parkour. So I'm very happy to hand over to Mitch now to take you to your next presentation.
Ladies and gents, very good evening. I'm going to have to bust that myth straight away. Parkour is not risky. Genuinely. Ladies and gents, how are you? My name is Steve Mitchell. I am the independent chairman of Parkour UK. Just thinking about that introduction and perhaps why I'm here, storytelling is very important to me. So I'm the son of a speech and language therapist who dragged me around play centres and care centres in Chelmsley Wood in Birmingham for my youth and was constantly encouraging me to play sport. Father of 3 daughters. I am, as I just said to my colleagues here, 100% risk. I am literally throwing them off things, up things, and getting them to be as risky as possible. And in talking to a colleague about today, they said, Mitch, you're going to be brave or be safe. I'm going to be very brave this evening, and hopefully talk you through a little bit about parkour in this country and parkour globally, absolutely bust some myths about what it is and what it's not, and hopefully get you excited about what parkour can do within society and communities as a whole. Anybody in the room think they've got a decent idea as to what parkour is? Fire away. Give me your definition of parkour. Ah! Bad. Anybody want to add anything to that? Very good. You can come and join me. So yeah, a little bit of history, I guess, as to what parkour is and certainly what it's not. We would argue that you have all done. You all do parkour every day. It's basic human movement. There is absolutely an element of getting to A to B in an efficient, occasionally a silent, and an enjoyable way. It's fully inclusive. You don't have to be agile, you don't have to be lithe, you don't necessarily have to be athletic. It is literally about getting from A to B, potentially urban, also rural environments in a way that you enjoy. So we've all done it, because you've all played, explored, jumped off things when you were younger, climbed trees, etc. So it absolutely lives and breathes in all of us. And if my chief exec was here, usually he'd say, when did you all stop doing parkour? Because you have been doing parkour since you were born. So parkour finds itself in lots of different forms, I guess, and there'll be some of you in the room thinking, parkour is that stuff where people jump off buildings, right? Parkour is the stuff where people hang off cranes and say we're doing parkour. If you're on the BBC Wales website yesterday, you'd have seen an absolute classic from BBC Wales that said, daredevil parkour people climbing on Millennium Stadium. Well, not really daredevil parkour people, just 2 plonkers. I don't think there's any children in there, is there? And they weren't parkour athletes, trussers, free runners. They were just plonkers climbing in places they shouldn't. but the media love to sensationalise the fact that that's parkour, or they associate it. Absolutely not. You maybe not have been on the BBC News website yesterday, and I've gone off tack already, sorry. So the history of parkour, linked back to the French military, Georges Gibert, who passed it down to his son, and they created the movement, the Yamakasi, who are the founders, strong body, strong spirit, strong mind. And interestingly enough, the Yamakasi are all still alive. They're all still under the age of 45. They don't sit around in blazers in big governing body organisations or big centres in London that host massive events. They're all part, I guess, some might argue, engaged with the community in some way, shape or form, all doing their own different things globally. One of the most recognised founders is a guy called Sebastian Foucan. Some of you will remember him from leaping from a crane to a helicopter in a James Bond film. Was he doing parkour when he did that? Absolutely not. Has he been involved with parkour since it was founded? 100%. Does he believe that we all have a right to play and explore? Absolutely. So occasionally called art de déplacement. If you do it, if you're a traditionalist, you are a traceur or a traceuse, which is all about finding your route, and as you said, getting from A to B. But there is hugely an element, and this is the interesting piece for us, certainly in this country and globally, in when we have now been recognised as a sport and as a governing body, we've been able to define what it is and what it's not. Because there are lots of people that would have a view on what it is and what it's not. And you might argue that, given our version or our definition of it's been around since you were all born and we could all move and we could all walk, that how do you define what it is and what it's not? In January of 2017, we were recognised as a sport and as a governing body in this country by the organisations, government departments that recognise sports and recognise governing bodies. And it allowed us, I guess, to finally do this for the first time. The thing that surprises a lot of people, we are primarily a non-competitive sport. How can you have sport without competition? You all cry, or maybe you don't. But yes, the principle of running, of movement, of getting from A to B, coordination, agility, however, not just getting from A to B in the fastest possible time. There is absolutely a chunk of the community that want to do that, want to show off, want to demonstrate how fast or how agile they can be, but that's a very small segment of the community. The majority of the community, leading on to the second point on the slide, there is a whole element of parkour around self-improvement. There is a massive element about mind and body, not just how physically active and how agile you can be. And there is a massive element about self-discipline and personal confidence, I suppose, and personal determination. And what you do see in the media and on social media channels, when you see a parkour athlete, a free runner, leaping from building X to building Y, they don't just go up there and do it. They have dedicated time, energy and effort to make sure that they can make that jump. They can bridge that gap. And they will have done a jump of, let's say, 8 foot at 90% of their running ability, 100 times out of 100 to make sure they can land it before they even think about taking it to height. And when you say take it to height, that might be they take it up a foot or 2 foot, and they will continue to practice and practice and practice and practice to get it right. There is a whole ethos within the community that says, I'm going to practice that jump 100 times, and if they fail on 99, they'll go back to 1 and start again. So they will continue to commit to get it right, mind and body, not just, I'm going to go straight to the top of a roof and leap from A to B. Of course, there is a segment of the community that want to practice parkour in that way. That's not necessarily something we would endorse and celebrate, but they have proven they can do it to themselves on the ground level, time after time. So we're not just a sport, we are more than a sport, philosophy, lifestyle, and absolutely for this evening, a form of play. So we are now recognised as a governing body, which allows us to have that clear delineation between what is and what isn't. It allows a global movement to now take place. So as the first pioneering governing body in the UK, others are now following suit. So New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, elements of Europe are building an equivalent of Parkour UK in their countries using what we've built here. That allows you to build a global federation, and we are definitely not going to behave like FIFA. but Parkour Earth has begun, which is international, a single international umbrella body for all of the individual organisations like ours around the country and around the globe, sorry. In relation to sport and play and exploration in this country, we have lots of great relationships with different aspects of the community. So some of you will have come across organisations like the Youth Sport Trust or the Association for PE, UK Active, lots of organisations that we've really tried to build a relationship with to make sure that parkour is present, not just in schools and in playgrounds, but a big, strong ethos in universities and colleges and educational settings. We've set some standards around equipment, so people can't just set it up in their in a warehouse and say we are a parkour gym. We actually have some standards in place, so you can't just get away with trying to cut corners. And it might surprise you, I think the number's about 55 now. There are a number of parkour parks around the country. You'll see them in green spaces and also in grey spaces, and you'll see people practicing on them all the time. And a lot of people might not know how to use them. That is not a problem. The idea is that you can just explore and play, and if you need to hang, you need to swing, you need to move, you need to jump, that's absolutely fine. So increasingly more and more parkour parks are being built in grey space as well as green space. Again, just to share some of the work that our community do, we as a governing body are fundamentally here to represent our community. We're not here to bully them out of the way, we're not here to tell them what to do, like a number of other governing bodies in this country. But we've got some great work that happens in secondary schools where we teach the French language through movement. We've got some great work happening with over 60s where we are using parkour around falls prevention. There is some wonderful video footage that you can find on our website and on our community site, because the people that make parkour happen have all grown up with social media, GoPros and videography, so some absolutely wonderful content you can find out there. Some brilliant stuff happening globally where we're making connections with people using parkour in the Middle East to address social and community barriers over there. Increasingly looking at things like virtual reality. So how might you put a virtual reality headset on to understand what a parkour class looks like, bust the myth that I'm not going to turn out to a class and jump off a building, I'm going to go and play and explore. So we're trying to push the envelope, and our community are certainly doing that, and you would probably find down the road from you, wherever you may be, you will find a parkour organisation making some of those kind of things happen. We've tried our best to tag on to some of the social media campaigns like This Girl Can, and we'll continue to try and bring our community together. I was just saying earlier on, we have like a governing body has to, every year to have an AGM. We absolutely do not have an AGM, we have an AG Jam, where our community get together, and when they get together they call it a jam. We just add that to the bit of the formality, and I absolutely don't sit at the front of a desk with 7 officers alongside me and read papers to the community. We have it in a parkour park. Last year we acknowledged that 2 of the members of our community had passed away, not through doing parkour, and instead of having a minute's silence, we had a minute's worth of silent movement, which for a retired rugby player in the parkour park is a challenge, but we have to make these things happen. Just a few little bits. Because we are a young and vibrant sport, we don't have 100 years worth of history and blazers to deal with. We don't have lots of rules. We absolutely have problems and challenges with the law and with the media. Positive trespass is a term that our community use all the time, and that's not trespass for being naughty, that's trespass for exploring. Last year we had a fascinating exchange with Horsham Council, because Horsham, one of the council members said, if you are doing parkour in Horsham City Centre, you should be arrested. Front page headline. But actually, when you scratch under the surface of why they tried to slap a PSPO on us, or the community there, again, it was just complete misunderstanding. Parkour athletes, the parkour community on the whole are very vegan. They are very anti-brand. They certainly don't do drugs. Most of them don't drink. If you asked them to stop what they were doing outside the library because it was causing you a problem, they wouldn't tell you to be off, or they wouldn't have an argument with you. They'd have a discussion and say, well, why is what I'm doing such a problem to you? I'm just exploring, just appreciating. I'm climbing over things. I'm not trying to cause a distraction. We often get the, oh, you're the skateboarding of the naughties, the people that would stand on the street corner, and I'm not stigmatising skateboarding here, smoking dope drinking booze and throwing things at old ladies. We are absolutely not that, and the community on the whole would want to have a conversation with you about why are you so offended that I'm moving around this grey space, this urban space. We are lots of content online. Lots of young people know about us, want to do us, want to explore more. Lots of relationships with movie makers, with people like Google and YouTube who have our community on retainers just to go and produce really exciting content. You'll see us in things like Assassin's Creed. There's an element of parkour in Fortnite. But you have to embrace that, and we have to work with that to make that happen. The point I'll make just at the end there, the subtlety, if we have any gymnasts in the room, then apologies, but not really. We are so exciting to British Gymnastics and the International Gymnastics Federation that they want to own us. So we have a lovely social media campaign called #WeAreNotGymnastics, because we are not gymnastics and they will not own us. If you want to engage in that, it's a very separate discussion. I'll leave this small grenade here for now as well. Sport England, who we, I suppose, fall under the auspices of, fascinating research today. We don't have a Minister for Play anymore, is that right? But we have a Minister for Sport, and we have a Minister for Loneliness, and we have a Minister for Suicide. What's happened to that connection there? Sport England invests over £1.2 billion every 4 years. They have consistently invested in governing bodies that look and smell like the ones there. The number on the right-hand side should be the bit that fascinates you the most. We as Parkour in our community for 2 years now have had some decent data that says people do this. That's where we sit on a league table. The naught should probably surprise you all. But we are constantly kind of pushing that boundary and those envelopes to say, well, why don't you want to invest in us? We've got this wonderful falls prevention work. We've got this stuff happening with mental health. We have this brilliant stuff in schools. But we are perhaps slightly disruptive and slightly difficult because we don't fit, we don't have clubhouses, we don't have rules, we don't necessarily have membership because you have to sign up every year to get your insurance. If you make Parkour happen, we'd love you to be a member. Please come into our family. Don't have to sign up and pay lots of money and force you into things that you might not want to do. But that's one of my favourite slides. #Give Parkour a go. You've all done it, you all continue to do it. I'd love for you to think about doing it or find out a bit more about it. As I said, we are not jumping off buildings. And if I could leave you with 2 or 3 things specifically, I guess, linked to our environments and the things that we're trying to do. How is it right that children in today's world spend less time outside than prisoners? How have we got 1 in 4 boys only doing 30 minutes of physical activity a day? Why don't we have a Minister for Play and Adventure and Risk? I think that would be great. And if you follow us or our Chief Exec, there is a fascinating kind of parallel campaign that links to the agenda this evening called No Ball Games. Tim will know it well. Who started putting No Ball Game signs up in local communities? Eugene and his gang, and lots of, I say gang, Eugene and his following love to take those signs down or go and put a K and a W before the N and the O in the middle. So No Ball Games. There's a #No Ball Games campaign that you should all engage with, because it is not right that we are not allowed to play in grey space. I could go on. Thank you all. I look forward to some more grenades when we have a conversation in a bit. I'm now handing over to Kathryn. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me, Jenny, to be here tonight. I think this is a really timely kind of topic and very interesting, so it's great to see so many people here this evening. So I'm going to be talking about the potential links between the decline in children's risky play and children's fears and anxieties. So children's play has changed dramatically in quality and quantity over the past 60 years or so. And to crudely illustrate this changing nature of children's play, I took to Google Images. And I started by searching 1950s children playing, and I chose an image from one of the first few that came up in the search. And this shows a group of children playing together, outdoors, engaged in kind of creative, physical play without any adult supervision. And I did the same search for every decade between then and now. And as we go through them, you'll notice that these images really depict the fundamental changes that have occurred in children's play throughout this time period. So children's play has changed from being outdoors, either in the street or in nature, to being indoors, either at home or in purpose-built play areas. It shifted from being mostly child-led and unstructured to being largely adult-led, heavily supervised and highly structured. And it's gone from being social and physical to being individual and sedentary. And children tell us that they're happiest when they're at play. And taking risks is a fundamental part of children's play. And risky play can take many forms. So climbing trees, riding a bike at speed, playing near dangerous elements such as fire or water, using adult tools, rough and tumble play, and also playing out of sight of adults. But over the last 50 years or so, opportunities for children to play outdoors in risky and adventurous ways have dramatically declined. So today, only a very small minority of children aged 10 years or younger are allowed to go outside the home on their own. And a survey commissioned by the Children's Society reported that almost half of adults surveyed thought the youngest age at which a child should be allowed to play outside unsupervised was 14 years of age. And also children today spend so little time outdoors, and they have a far more sedentary lifestyle than children did just a generation ago. So only 37% of children play outdoors every day, and the average child is inactive for 8.5 hours a day. And there's growing scientific evidence that regular access and connection to nature is good for both our physical and our mental well-being. But given that most children don't even get to explore outside in the vicinity of their own home, it's perhaps not surprising that only a really very small minority get to spend time in the natural world, where there is a wealth of opportunities for children to play in adventurous, risky ways. So children today simply do not have the same opportunities to engage in risky, adventurous play as their parents and grandparents did. So across that same time period that we're seeing this reduction in children's outdoor risky play, there's also been a reported rise and increase in rates of mental health problems, including anxiety and depression in children and adolescents. And okay, more recently, children are reporting a decline in their self-reported happiness and satisfaction with life. And to illustrate the scale of the mental health problem faced by children today, 1 in 10 children have a diagnosable mental health problem. So that's approximately 3 children in every classroom. And anxiety is an especially common problem. So 1 in 6 children will experience difficulties with anxiety during their childhood. And while physical and mental health problems could be some of the most obvious consequences of this decline in outdoor risky play, there are probably also less obvious but equally important consequences. So things like declining emotional resilience, a reduced ability to appraise risks, and these are essential skills for a healthy and successful adult life. So there are probably many reasons for the rise in mental health issues that we're seeing experienced by children over the past 50 or 60 years. But one hypothesis that's been put forward is that denying children the opportunity to experience age-appropriate challenge and risk through play may in part be contributing to this rise in emotional problems such as anxiety that we're seeing. So what is it about risky play that may help protect children from developing persistent and severe fears and anxiety? So I guess core to risky play, and some of the other speakers have already mentioned this, is the range of emotions that children get to experience when they, for example, are climbing higher than they've ever climbed before, or riding their bike or scooter down a particularly steep hill. And it's that same mix of emotions that most of us will experience when we ride a roller coaster. So it's that delicate balance between fear and anxiety and thrill and excitement in the face of uncertainty. So during risky play, children have the opportunity to challenge their physical and mental limits. They get to master feelings of fear and thrill and the physical sensations that accompany them. They get to learn about risks and ways of coping with them. And it's these experiences that might help to protect children from developing more severe and persistent fears and anxiety when faced with future uncertain or potentially threatening situations. So there are a whole host of barriers which are driving this decline in children's risky outdoor play. But I think one of the most important is this creeping culture of risk aversion that we're seeing. And as gatekeepers of children's play, parents are repeatedly exposed to the philosophy that we need to keep our children as safe as possible. And I would argue that a consequence of that has been a growth in fear-based caregiving. So fear-based caregiving is characterized by overprotective, over-controlling behaviors that really act to restrict our children's independence and freedoms. So parents face, I think, a very real dilemma when making decisions about letting their children experience risky outdoor play. And making these decisions requires kind of balancing what parents know about the opportunities and benefits of being outdoors and playing in an adventurous way, with that kind of very real and often very kind of visceral and physical kind of need that we have to keep our children safe from harm and danger. So in a recent study where we spoke to mums and dads about their perceptions of risky play, what they told us is that they're aware of the many and varied benefits of play for their child. But at the same time, parents told us that the feelings and thoughts that they have about fear and danger often loom larger, and they have a disproportionate impact on the decisions that they make about their child's play experiences. And that's partly because we're obviously biologically driven to protect our children and to keep them safe. But also, as humans, we don't kind of make decisions rationally based on the known kind of facts and figures about the kind of likelihood and impact of risks and of danger. Instead, our decisions and our actions are often distorted. They're filtered through our own experiences, through our conscious and unconscious biases, and they're impacted by our emotions and our physical feelings. So to illustrate kind of the wonkiness of some of our perceptions of risk about children's play, I chose two quotes from the recent study that we did with mothers and fathers. And parents in our study frequently told us that the home was the safest environment for their child, whereas the outdoor natural environment was risky and dangerous. But ironically, statistics on accidents and abuse to children routinely tell us that by far the most dangerous place for a child to be is at home. And parents also told us that one of their greatest fears is often around stranger danger and their child being abducted and killed. And that was frequently cited as a barrier to outdoor risky play. But the likelihood of that is actually incredibly rare. So rare that in the UK, exact figures on the number of children abducted and killed by strangers aren't really readily available. But because these kind of horrendous, tragic crimes are etched into our collective memory because of mass media coverage, it's really easy for us to bring them to mind despite their rarity. And then we use that kind of readily available example to predict the likelihood of something similar happening to our own child. And as a consequence, we tend to vastly overestimate the risk. So as a parent myself, I completely understand that we all want to keep our children safe from harm and danger. And the decline in outdoor risky play is a far too complex problem to base kind of, or to blame solely on caregiving. There are many, many barriers. And I think fear-based caregiving is just one important element worthy of attention. And there is no magic bullet to get children outdoors playing in risky and adventurous ways. But I have a very real concern that we are keeping our children too safe. And that this overprotection may have unintended negative consequences for our children's mental and physical health, their well-being and development. And I'm going to finish there and hand over to Tim.
Thank you very much, Kathryn, and thanks to all our speakers. That was slightly gloomy, wasn't it? I'm hoping that I'm going to offer you a kind of a way out of this confusion and mess, and Nicola's already hinted at it. I want to just say a little bit about play and this connection with risk and uncertainty, and because I don't think we've maybe said quite enough yet, which is that I think one of the reasons why our species is, for better or worse, the dominant species on the planet is because the young of our species are such incredible learning machines. And if you think about it, human babies are incredibly dependent upon adults for their most basic needs, much more so than almost any other animal. And yet, by the time they're even 4 or 5 years old, they have amassed an incredible array of competencies. And much of what they learn and have learned through the 200, 300, 500,000 year history of our species, they learn through play, through exploring, and through experimenting. And yet, when we think about our culture today and the kind of places, the facilities that we create that are a kind of recognition and a response to this astonishing learning impulse, these are the kind of things that we create. So what I'm going to kind of walk you through is, if you like, something that's the antidote to this, because there is an antidote to this. And in order to do that, I'm going to show you a little video. And the video is a short clip from a forest school session. Now, forest school is a model or an approach to learning which really sees the outdoors as a rich and open-ended learning environment for children to learn all sorts of skills and competencies, and including lots of the stuff that Kathryn was talking about. I make no apology for being a fan of Forest School. I am, for my sins, the patron of the Forest School Association, which is a purely honorific title. But what I'm about to show you is just a short 2-minute clip of a session of a forest school run by this organisation. It's quite grainy. It's not got, you know, inspirational music or a voiceover in the background. But what I want you to do is just watch what's unfolding, what the children are doing, and think about what the children are getting from this experience. And I'm going to actually give you a little bit of time afterwards to just get into that a bit more. So, hands up, how many educators do we have in the room? Quick show of hand, educators. Okay, so this is a chance for you to sort of practice your observational skills, and then chat about it afterwards. So, fingers crossed for the technology. Watch, have a think, and then I'll give you a bit of time afterwards to reflect and talk. Okay, so as promised, I actually want to hear what you were talking about. So just shout out words, short phrases. What do you think the children were getting out of that experience? Anyone? Creativity, okay. Other things? Teamwork, yes. Knowing their own limits. I think I might come back to that, but because that's an interesting one. Any others? Risk-taking, yes. But I would say managed risk-taking. You know, they weren't, rather like Mitchell, they weren't kind of throwing themselves across that branch. They were doing parkour. They were moderating their interaction with the environment. Yes, at that. Problem solving, yes. In various ways at various points, yes? Lack of team building. Are you referring to the slightly snipey remarks that were going on at certain points? Again, I'm going to come back to the girls, but also there was some points where the two girls at the front, sometimes they were being quite supportive with each other, but there were 1 or 2 points where they were being a little bit snipey. Newsflash, sometimes children are not very nice to each other. Okay? Newsflash number 2, sometimes grown-ups are not very nice to each other. Okay? I hope you can see where I'm going with that, but time is short, so I'm going to move on. Any other things that, yes? Embodied learning. So, understanding what their bodies, how their bodies work, balance, proprioception, all of that, sometimes called physical literacy, or it was in that territory, yes, again, Mitch's territory, probably. Sense of achievement, that was very clear, for particularly the girl at front, and again, speaks to some of what Kathryn was talking about it was quite an emotional journey that those girls were doing. Yes, watching. Yes. So, lots of stuff. I hope you agree. If we're talking about that balance, that set of scales that Kathryn was showing us, I hope you'd agree there's quite a lot that's on the kind of upside of that. But I just want to say a little bit more about the girl at the back, because I think one of the most interesting things about that little video clip is what's going on for the girl at the back. So time is short, so I'm going to give you my take on what was going on for her. She got scared and she bailed out. She was outside of her comfort zone and she did not feel safe, and she did something about it in order to kind of get back to a place where she could feel safe. Now, if you think about that, that's a pretty sophisticated competence. It's a pretty useful life skill. This film was actually made about 10 or 11 years ago. So these girls, they're not 4 years old and playing in the woods. They're sort of 16 and 17 years old. And, well, parents of girls, I'll leave you to imagine where they might be a few hours later on tonight or on a Saturday night. So that ability to know what it feels like to be outside of your comfort zone and to be able to get into a safer situation could save their lives. And more to the point, that competence, so we all have a different risk thermostat. Yes, again, Nicola alluded to that. Some of us have a bigger appetite for risk than others. But we only figure out our tolerance for risk by engaging with uncertainty, by knowing what it feels like to be close to the edge. No one else can teach us that. We learn it through our own experience. And in that situation, one of the amazing things that was happening was that the educators that were in the frame, and let's remember there were educators there, were sufficiently clear about what they wanted the children to learn and gain from the experience that they didn't step in. At no point did the educators even say, be careful. I know what, as a parent, it's so tempting to use that phrase, but I hope you can see how that would have actually probably undermined the richness of the experience for those children. So, what I'm going to suggest to you is that underlying that understanding and approach of the educators is precisely the approach that Nicola talked about earlier, which is risk-benefit assessment. The conscious weighing up of the upside and the downside of risk. Because what we used to have 10, 15 years ago when we constructed places for children to play was stuff like this. But this next picture is of one of the more recent public unsupervised playgrounds, not an adventure playground, that's been built actually in the Olympic Park in London. I hope you agree it looks a little bit different to this. And the reason this is happening is because of this document and the culture change that has brought about. So risk-benefit assessment is the antidote to what you could call the kind of socially transmitted disease of excessive risk aversion. It's a system fix for the system failure of the zero risk mindset, which is not just, in fact, not really about parents. It's about a kind of social, society-wide confusion. And as Nicola said, at the heart of this document and at the heart of the process is making visible the upside of risk, of making educators, designers, schools and councils bring their thinking about the good things that happen when children take risks into their decision making. And that's extremely powerful. And not only that, its support for this approach is growing. So that's a short collection of some of the organisations that have formally signed up to supporting risk-benefit assessment, including the Health and Safety Executive, the people who have the big stick when it comes to public safety. So, as I say, I have good news for you. And actually, this is a document that I think Kathryn was quoting from. This is a quote from a statement about outdoor play with its risks that's come out of a Canadian consensus grouping. And one of the interesting things that happened in Canada a couple of years ago, there was a court case that went to the Supreme Court about a child who had an accident on a playground during a summer play scheme. And the court decided in favour of the council that was running the scheme and rejected the claim for compensation despite the fact that the child had a serious accident. And you can find the case online in the Supreme Court of British Columbia. So we're seeing right the way from top to bottom now a new story around risk, which is not one about the kind of zero risk mindset and the overprotection of children, but about a more balanced approach. And so my final image is one of these kind of things that probably crops up on some of your social media from time to time. And this is partly, of course, a message about education and learning, and the Vygotskians in the room will be familiar with what's being pointed out here. But I also think that this message is a message for us, that part of what we need to do in order to allow children to encounter with uncertainty and learn how to deal with an uncertain but rather adventurous and exciting life, we need ourselves to get a little bit outside of our own comfort zones in order to allow children to get outside of theirs. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks to all our speakers. I'd like to invite the speakers to come back up to the front. We're going to have a panel discussion now. We have some people at the back with roving mics, I think. Person at the front. And what we're going to do is we're going to take 2 or 3 questions from the audience, and then we're going to invite our panel to comment on them collectively. Maybe there'll be a natural lead for some of them, but we want to encourage some kind of discussion and back and forth. So let's start off. Put your hand up if you have a question, and then Anna can get round to you with the mic.
Thank you. May I ask Stephen, please, what is your definition of physical literacy, which I saw on the top of one of your slides for under 5 children?
Okay, so we've got one question about physical literacy, and then I'll take maybe 2 more from the audience, and then get a panel opinion. One over here.
Thanks. This question was prompted by Dr. Lester's presentation, but is for the whole panel. So far we've really focused on children's play, and there was a statistic which says that 37% of children don't spend time outdoors. But I think it's really important to bring into this conversation adult play, and I wonder what the stat would be for how much time adults spend outdoors. I mean, are we just waking up in the morning, getting into our cars, driving to our office, getting back into our cars, and spending our evenings in our homes? I mean, how often are we... Basically, my point is, as well, there's also an image of some children in front of various screens. And as a video game researcher, that prompts other thoughts in my head. But I think, yeah, we need to bring in the idea of what kind of example are we adults setting. And my question is, how can we include conversations about adult play alongside and integrated with this discussion about the importance and centrality of children's play?
Thank you very much. One final question before we turn to the panel.
Hi, mine's mostly for Kathryn. Just thinking about parenting and how parents, how we can encourage parents to encourage their children to do more outdoor play. Like you say, rationality kind of goes out the window when emotion and children's safety comes into it. So I was wondering whether you think showing them these statistics is a way to go, or is there any better sort of strategy for encouraging parents and children to do more outdoor play?
Okay, great. So over to you, panel. I guess we had a direct question to Mitch first of all. So do you want to kick us off with the physical literacy question?
It was very direct, wasn't it? I'm not sure whether I'm necessarily the right academic or scientist to define what physical literacy is. In my personal opinion, and I guess from and this is part parent, part parkour, part someone that works in the sector, is that physical literacy is a term used to define an individual's ability to move, to function, to have an ability to be agile, to jump, to walk. There's some horror stories about children arriving at secondary school unable to run, probably because they were unable to walk to start with, or they didn't walk enough. And I think from my personal perspective, I'd want physical literacy to be given the same importance on the curriculum as numeracy and literacy. And I think if you read some of the research from UK Active around Generation Inactive, from Sport England now taking a bigger interest in under fives as well as over fives, it's just been a forgotten part of the curriculum, not least because of the play aspect. And I'm probably now skirting around the edges of answering the question, but I guess physical literacy to me means young people that have an ability to move, jump, catch, throw, and so forth. Is that sufficient of an answer? Oh, okay, right.
So let's move on to adult play.
Actually, I'll leap in, but Mitch and I, because the connection with parkour, of course, is intriguing. I mean, there are all sorts of fascinating philosophical, moral, ethical paths that you can go down around the significance of play in all our lives. Brian Sutton Smith, some of you will know, the sort of preeminent play scholar, probably of the last century, talked about 6 rhetorics of play that really go right back to, you know, the pre-Socratics and further back, and raise really interesting questions about what a meaningful and kind of well-lived or playfully lived life is. I'm going to go in a slightly different direction because I think I'm slightly worried about the line of thought that says we all play, we all need to play more. I'm not saying you said that, but I think there is something different and important about what happens when children play compared to adults. And it's sometimes hard to draw the line, but I'll give you a really quick anecdote. So when my daughter was about 7 or 8, we were walking, through the countryside, and there was a group of adults and her, and there was a stile up ahead of us. And the stile, we did not need to use the stile to carry on our walk. We could just walk by the stile because, in fact, there was no fence. All the grown-ups walked past the stile, but my daughter climbed over the stile, okay, unprompted, and I reckon a significant proportion of children of her age would have done that. So there was something intuitive, impulsive, unconscious even, and certainly unself-conscious about her playfulness that I think is different even from parkour, and that speaks to this, some of the important features of play that make it kind of quite constitutive of childhood in a way that isn't the case with adults.
I think from my perspective, don't we have an obligation to play and an obligation to move? Is it not a human right, a human obligation? In the parkour community, there is some great work happening around the intergenerational piece about parents, grandparents and children doing parkour together. There's an incredible lady in London who set up a movement, and I don't joke when I say this, #BringYourGran, on the basis of she was bringing her grandma to explore, and she was bringing her grandma to parkour classes. I'm not sure there's many traditional sports that would think like that or behave like that. Parkour is one that perhaps can do that. But actually, if you look at why are these young children inactive, obese, suffering from diabetes, I guess there's a parental element in that, because if parents aren't moving and parents aren't playing, and the historical 20 or 30 years ago Saturday morning where I guess some of us that are of that age would have grown up at an environment that meant you could pick up a bat, a ball, throw it, chuck it, lob it, join in, not join in, that seems to have disappeared. So yeah, the intergenerational piece is important, and I guess we're trying to do something about it as an unfunded sport.
Can I just come in on that question? This summer, for the first time, I decided to do a little questionnaire with parents who were attending the adventure playground with their children. And the first question I asked was, why did you bring your children here? And every single parent I spoke to said, I want to get them away from screens. I want to get them away from iPads and iPhones and so on, which is great. But every single parent there also spent time on their iPhone or while their children were playing. So we're getting very mixed messages from adults on this. I totally agree with Tim that play changes as people get older. We work with adolescents as well, and you can see that they become much more self-conscious, and they still want to play, but they can flit from being very self-conscious to being very silly and back again over and over again. I think what we need from adults is for adults to be more playful and to be more understanding and tolerant of children play, you know, to support the idea that play is messy and that children might get dirty and you know, they might be noisy. That's what I want to see from adults.
I guess, Kathryn, that might lead into the last question around parent-child interactions. Would you like to speak to that question?
Sure. So I think the message that I would probably, that I kind of also need to take on board as a parent myself, is that I actually think the best thing that parents can do in terms of encouraging their children to get outdoors and play in risky and adventurous ways is actually to step back. So to not try and get too over involved. I think we have a tendency to kind of underestimate the capabilities of children. And I think sometimes we need to let them lead and kind of have freedom to explore and play without that being managed and overscheduled and guided by parents. And I think there are things that we can do as parents to kind of provide or help our children kind of get the most out of those opportunities. And to kind of, so we need to be there to support them when there are real and present risks and dangers, you know, that pose real threats to their well-being. But we don't need to be there when they're just testing their limits, and we don't need to be right on top of them. I mean, things that we can do are making sure that we're gently kind of guiding children to learn about how to navigate traffic safely, so that when they're outdoors, we can feel confident that they know how to manage that safely. But I think also one of the messages that I would like to try and get across is that sometimes when I'm with my children and they're doing something where I can feel myself getting that kind of anxiety, that visceral kind of feeling that I spoke about, it's actually to remember that our fear is not their fear. And that I think if we can try and even just count to 10 before you step in and intervene, then that's a very small thing that everyone can do tomorrow. So just sit with that level of uncomfortableness that you might be experiencing. Kind of just see, kind of just test what that feels like, and also just observe kind of how capable your child can actually be in the moment. Because it's easy to lose sight of that when you're feeling anxious and kind of nervous about what's going to happen. So yeah, just count to 10 and just take a moment to sit with your own fears. Don't project them necessarily on your children.
Great top tip, thank you. So let's take another round of questions. Hopefully you've been cooking some up while you're sitting there. So one there, one in the back row, and one here.
I'm really interested in this question of the teenagers playing. Because I think the answers to whether adults need to play more and the difference between children and adults playing point in two directions. It points to the social construction of childhood and children as people who play and adults as people who work. And then we've got Mitch saying more that we're all kind of wired, you know, cognitively and physically wired to play most of the time. So we've got this cultural tension, and the teenagers are a key point where we can shift. Maybe if we could keep the adults playing and keep the children playing through their teenage years until they become the adults, it would mean adults that would then allow their children to play more, breaking a cycle of fearful caregiving. So yeah, particularly a comment on the teenagers would be appreciated.
Good evening, everybody. I have a question related to the way we try to make children play, or how to design children's play. It's my impression that the way children play reflects very much the way adults are building their life. So we have tablets, we have computers, all our time we spend on computers. Does our children do the same? So for us, in order to change anything in the way children play, should we look only at the way we design playing children, or should we look at the way we as adults are living our lives with them?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And you can use this mic.
Thank you. Kathryn, this is about your presentation, but I noticed that your photos and your examples are all related to mothers, and I wondered if that was a coincidence or if you found in your research that mothers are somehow more a barrier to risky play, and if the rest of the panel has identified any gender differences as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So I guess there was some interesting, the first two questions had something in common, in that there's this idea of intergenerational play, and is there a kind of significant transition at the teenage years? And we know children are often taking risks and exploring in different ways in that period of their lives. Would anybody like to make an opening comment on that?
I'll go if you want. I mean, one of the points that the reason why I use that table, I guess, is to point out that the modern teenager or the modern young person doesn't perhaps want to consume physical activity and sport like we may have done 20 or 30 years ago. Parkour gets bandied about as a lifestyle sport, whether that's skateboarding, slacklining, obstacle course racing, and so forth. Now, I don't know whether it's a solution to the teenage piece, but if you again, recent research, people know what parkour is and what it isn't. They also perhaps are saying, I don't want to join the football club or the cricket club or the traditional thing that you're trying to force feed me. So I guess I think we'd be part of the solution, but equally we've got to understand what those social drivers and what their personal drivers might be. But what the research would tell you, and what 2012 and the legacy of 2012 tells us from a sporting perspective of anything, is that made no difference whatsoever. We've got fatter kids, we've got more kids with diabetes, we've got more kids that are less active. So it wasn't the event and it wasn't traditional sport that was doing it, which I guess is why things like slacklining in a park, where you don't need to turn up, become a member, pay a subscription fee, have to be there every Tuesday to get a game, and parkour and others are perhaps more of the moment. And this whole introduction of sport and activity, which is informal, social, a lot of the fantastic work that's happening, I suppose, in the guerrilla movements in certain sports. Swim Dem Crew, as an example, in London, black professional young people that can't swim age 25 learn to swim with each other through eating together, socialising together and swimming. They don't turn up to the swimming baths to have a lesson, they do it for fun and for social activity. So I think sport and activity in particular, perhaps less so in play, I'm sure my three esteemed colleagues will have a better view on that. We need to move slightly with the times and not be force-feeding young people the things that they don't want to do and they don't want to consume.
Nicola, I wonder if you could comment, because I know you get teenagers through your doors quite frequently.
Well, I mean, I firmly believe that teenagers need to play and have a right to play as well. I was working a session last night at the Adventure Playground, and we had a very well-meaning programme of social education lined up for them, and they decided they would like to play hide and seek in the dark. So we went with hide and seek in the dark, but they flit. You know, some days they are going to sit down and have a more structured and more grown-up conversation. Other times they just want to let off steam and relax and chill, like we all do.
Then second question was around screen time. Again, it's a topic that comes up repeatedly. I quite enjoy playing video games, so I quite like to see a balanced view on this. Is that something that the panel have got any comments on?
I'll leap in. I until 2 or 3 years ago, I think I had a fairly sort of simple take on technology, which is that the problem really was not about the technology. The problem was about the fact that children were not given enough opportunities to do a lot of other stuff. So spending time on screens and a lot of time on screens was the easiest option, and children were missing out simply because of all the other things they weren't doing. I'm now changing my view on that. I am increasingly concerned about the growth of the attention economy and the way that you know, the smartest people on the planet and most well-paid people on the planet are now spending huge amounts of time and energy getting us all to spend as much time as possible on these, including children, including really young children, and that is rather, it's a game-changing situation. And so I now think we need, as a society and as a culture, to be more aggressive and to look to the tech companies and to the governments who regulate them or don't to really rein in on some of this stuff, because I really am worrying. I was entirely relaxed with the analogy I used to make about kind of having a balanced diet of childhood experiences, of which, you know, screens and games might well be part. But I think the extent to which these now grab all of our attention and seek to maintain and sustain it is troubling me. And I think, just more broadly, that question about adult society and how, in different ways, adult societies might shape children's play. I think one of my experiences, and I've been lucky enough to speak and do work in a large number of countries around the world, including several kind of low and middle income situations, is that nobody finds any resistance to the idea of children having some everyday freedom in their lives, some space and time when they can play, when they can explore, when they can gradually get to grips with the world around them. Nobody says that's a terrible idea. Everybody thinks that's a great idea. So I think our job as educators, as advocates, as decision makers, is to make that easier for parents. If we make it easier for parents, then parents will figure out their own response to that. And I am worried about the line of thought that says we need to be teaching or raising the awareness of parents. That sounds a bit like wagging our fingers at them. But I think what we do need to be doing is making it easier for parents to create that space and time when children can be children.
That's really interesting. Did you want to come in on that, Mitch?
If I can do, please. Yeah. I think perhaps, and whether it's in direct response to this question or not, or pick up a couple of Tim's points, but are we looking at this through the wrong end of the telescope? Children, young people are playing Fortnite, whether we like it or not, and in this room we can't change that. And they are going to spend more time on devices and technology. What sport, physical activity, play perhaps needs to try and do as much as it can is embrace that and acknowledge that that's happening. And that might be through virtual reality. It might be through using AI to connect to movement. It might be through the use of videography and photography. So again, because of the way, I suppose, the parkour community has grown up, they are using GoPros and iPhones to capture this footage. The fact that they're using it isn't necessarily a problem. We should embrace the fact that some people might want to be more interested in movement because of photography, art, videography, perhaps than just necessarily getting engaged. And I'd sit on a kind of coaching forum within a rugby community, and all of a sudden they've tried to acknowledge that Fortnite is there, so let's embrace Fortnite through rugby coaching skills, drills and language, and almost creating Fortnite-esque games which the kids love because it connects to something they're already doing. So again, as opposed to necessarily force-feeding them sport and activity that we used to grow up with and we think it's balls, cones and structure, why not embrace some of those elements into actually the practices and the environments that they're trying to get them to engage with. So I think there is society's not going to change, I don't think, as much as we might want it to and as much as we might want kids to be more active because we think it's the right thing to do. There has got to be a school of thought that embraces some of that and brings it into the environments that we're trying to shape and influence.
Nicola.
I'm going to give the counter view to that really, because I'm basically a total fuddy-duddy when it comes to IT. And I suppose I'm with Tim in that maybe 3 or 4 years ago I thought, well, you know, it's a choice. If children are choosing to do that in their leisure time, that's great, and that's fine. But I think we're increasingly seeing that it's addictive. And what is for sure is that the sheer amount of time that children are spending in front of screens is taking away from time that they would have been spending on other types of play. And we know that that has a huge impact on their mental health and their physical health. So I suppose we do incorporate a certain degree of this at the adventure playground. So the children love to do the fortnight dance, and so they do a lot of fortnight dance. I can't do it, but they can.
Did we capture that floss on video?
At the adventure, that was an embarrassment. That was, but
You were playing.
they do that at the adventure playground. But my offer to children when they come into the adventure playground is, would you like me to put that on charge for you? and that's where the iPhones stay.
Okay, well, let's change tack a little bit with the question about gender, and I think that's really interesting. There's a direct question to you about that, Kathryn, but it also came up in your talk, Nicola, so maybe if we take a comment from Kathryn and then from Nicola.
Yeah, I apologise for all of the images being mothers, but the reality of much of the kind of work that I do looking at these questions, at least from a research perspective, is that some of those images are actually taken from research projects that I've done. And predominantly when we try to recruit people to come along to take part in studies, we find it quite difficult to get dads involved. It's not impossible, but it has been, until quite recently, predominantly mothers who are reported on in the scientific literature. That is changing, and my view is that dads are incredibly important, and they are still very much under-researched. And I mean, in the play literature, there is at least some evidence that suggests that dads undertake more rough and tumble physical play with their children. And in the anxiety literature, there is some mixed evidence that dads may have a larger role to play than mothers in terms of risk for childhood anxiety, but that relationship is still, the empirical evidence is still quite mixed. So yes, I apologise for the lack of dads in my presentation.
Nicola.
Okay. Well, I mentioned it in the context of schools, but it's applicable in other play settings as well. And I think what I've observed in schools, and this is purely my observation, is that with risk-taking behaviours like rough and tumble play, which is my kind of polite way of saying play fighting, often the male staff are much more comfortable with that and go, oh yeah, I remember doing that when I was a kid. And that I don't want to generalise because that's not always the case, but sometimes the female staff are a bit more kind of like, oh, you know, that's not what we're accustomed to. I don't want to speculate on whether that's because gender is a social construct or whether it's an innate difference. I don't know. What I would like to see, though, is I would like to see that a child has lots of different people in their lives, you know, mothers, fathers, people of different ages, and that's what I try to have at my play settings. I want to have a team where I have men, women, people from all sorts of different ethnicities, different ages working together, so that, because I think that's what children benefit from, seeing all these different role models and behaviours and personalities.
Thanks, Nicola. So I'm going to sneak in with a chair's question. I was really intrigued that we were talking about this idea of play, and one of the things that's come through really strongly is the most boring thing in the world, the risk assessment. And it's been interesting to see how facilitative that has been. And clearly it was a big piece of work to get that report together. I just wondered if the panel might like to reflect on some of the processes that went into producing that document that has been so enabling.
It's only 20 years of my life. I'm not joking. It was the process of it's an overused cliche, but the journey of making progress around risks and benefits in play, I think one of the ways of characterising it is that it was a clumsy conversation, in the sense that a lot of the heavy lifting went on with a group of about 15 or 20 people going back 20 years or so, who all agreed there was a problem. You know, it's like Alcoholics Anonymous. The first step is to agree you have a problem. But we all agreed that the playgrounds that we were building 20 years ago were appalling and an utter waste of money, and were, amongst other things, being shaped by a wrong-headed approach to risk. And then the regulators, the child safety people, the play advocates, the local authorities, the health people. We just tried to figure out a kind of a better philosophy, a better kind of set of values, which were really around balance and kind of a thoughtful approach. And part of it was based on the numbers, because I'm a numbers person. Really, the number of playground accidents is, and always has been, comparatively small. If you really want your child to hurt themselves in their free time, get them playing rugby or football or hockey or any ball game. It's about 20 or 30 times more likely for your child to end up in hospital, actually with a serious injury. Playgrounds really are off the chart when down at the bottom of the scale. So we did that. We had numbers, and we had this clumsy conversation. And the crucial bit took 2 years of bashing around a text and quite painful discussion. At one point, we had in the meeting the father of a child who had died on a playground accident talking to us about his views, because this is not easy, this stuff. And we worked through it, and I think that can serve as a model for the kind of conversations I think needs to happen in workplaces, maybe even needs to happen within family settings, and certainly I think needs to happen at the policy level. And internationally, I'm encouraging other countries to set up bodies where you have those different voices around the table, having a kind of respectful and open, and to some extent exploratory and open-ended exchange of views that try to figure out in a messy way a better way of striking this balance that I think everyone agrees we need to strike than what we've got at the moment.
Thanks. Nicola, sorry, did you want to come in, Kathryn?
I would just say I think the risk-benefit assessment is a great piece of work, but my issue with talking to parents is that there is a disconnect, that it's hard, like, that parents are still are ruled by kind of the emotional response, that actually presenting, they tell us that they don't think about risk in terms of impact and likelihood, that doesn't factor into their decision making in that kind of rational way. So I'm wondering how you think we move beyond kind of how can we kind of get the risk benefit assessment model to work when, as humans, we tend to not think rationally, especially when we're in an emotive situation.
Sure, I'll come back to that. And I think a couple of things. First is, I think we need to be very careful when we're talking about parents and parental attitudes on this. I think Nicola's exercise at the very start, inviting us to think about risk, reminds us that we do have different appetites when it comes to risk and safety. Parents do too. Some parents are in the market for buying knee pads for their toddlers to stop them from getting injuries from when they crawl on the floor. Other parents are quite happy to go away on holiday for 2 weeks and leave their children to fend for themselves in the kitchen. Most parents, I think, are somewhere in the middle, which is where, the sweet spot. And I think most parents understand, and we need to help them understand at an emotional level, that part of their job as parents is to help their children have the kind of experiences that enable them to be confident, capable, responsible, resilient people. And I think so it's not about giving them a risk-benefit assessment tool and saying, here, give your considered assessment of how this all stacks up. It's about supporting parental solidarity and giving more room for the voices of those parents who are actually quite articulate and concerned about this. The sort of parents who organise the playing out sessions that Nicola mentioned, the sort of parents who want their children to go to forest school, and that's a big group of parents. There's an outdoor kindergarten in London, or a model, and it's a private nursery, and it's entirely out of doors. They don't have an indoor base. 2 years ago or 3 years ago, there was one 12-place setting. Now there are, I think, 3 or 4 32-place full-time settings in this run by this private nursery, and this nursery has a waiting list of 200 parents. That would not be the case if all parents were entirely terrified of what was going to happen to their kids. That playground that I showed you earlier at Tumbling Bay in the Olympic Park is one of the most popular public playgrounds in London. It would not have anybody in it if all parents were terrified of what might happen to their kids. So I don't say I have all the answers, but I think one of the things we have to do is celebrate and support and give more of a voice to those parents who are already signed up to this approach, but just feeling quite isolated and under-supported.
Mitch, would you like to comment?
Yeah, just going to give you a quick example, or I suppose, of something that's happened in the parkour community. So, New Year's Eve 2016, a young man died on the, it's not called the subway in Paris, is it? The metro. He was train surfing with his group of friends. The media clearly said, young man dies doing parkour on a train, of course, because you do parkour on a train. Nye Newman's mum, Debbie Newman, has created a movement called Parkour Parents. And as a mum, she is now the biggest advocate, because she will talk to other parents about how her son came to life through parkour and how he came out of his shell because he didn't enjoy sport and traditional physical activity. And he died doing something that was, again, the young child's gone, so I can probably be a bit safer with my language. He died doing something stupid. He didn't die doing parkour. And we've tried to use Debbie and the movement, I suppose, that she's created around parents to say, it is safe, it is okay. Our insurers love us. We have no insurance claims against parkour. 114 people died doing hill walking, I think, last year. No one died doing parkour. More people died doing football. So we've got all of that kind of good stuff that we're trying to create, but actually using a parent that's lost a child through being a plonker to now kind of create something that says, as a parent, it is safe, it is okay, and I would encourage you to encourage your children to take part.
Thank you. Finally, Nicola, would you like to comment?
Well, just briefly, I think most parents are constantly doing risk-benefit assessments when they're observing their children, and maybe I think some parental fears are also completely rational. I think traffic is a very major danger to children, and so I think one of the top things we need to do is actually deal with traffic to enable more children to play out. I suppose just briefly on the Managing Risk in Play provision publication, I think it was quite revolutionary and liberating at its time. I think its real strength was in the consensus and the backing that it had, particularly from organisations like the Health and Safety Executive, which have given it real weight and credibility and longevity.
Thanks so much, Nicola. I think we've pretty much run out of time for this evening, so please join me in thanking our speakers.